Hey folks, how's it going? This is tax history. In this video, I'm going to cover three different taxes, specifically in England: the hearth tax, the window tax, and the brick tax. Some of these might have also had some applications outside of England, in the UK and other places, but I'm going to focus specifically on England because of the peculiarities of all of that. But just wanted to give the note that I'm aware that not all of the UK is England, so apologies to Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and others. So starting with the hearth tax. The hearth tax was a tax that actually appeared in a number of places at different times, but I'm going to speak specifically about the 1662 to 1689 tax in England. This was a tax on hearths, fireplaces, stoves inside your home. Sometimes called the chimney tax, but it's more appropriately the hearth tax or the fireplace tax. It was widely resented, both because it was intrusive and because it was considered punitive. The collection method was that collectors, often called chimneymen, would enter your home and they'd look around for hearths and fireplaces. If you had them, they'd count them, and then that would be the tax. That was how it would be levied. So obviously that's very intrusive. These could be relatively rough men, basically contractors, we might call them today. Men, not professional civil servants necessarily. They could just be some guys who had been hired by an agent. So they might be rude, they might be invasive, and it was considered very uncomfortable for people that they had to allow these strangers into their house just to charge them tax. So that was definitely one of the bigger sore points for this tax and why it was so unpopular. It was also important that if your chimney was stopped up or blocked or bricked over, that was exempt from the tax. That was not considered a hearth or a fireplace. That was non-taxable. So the chimneymen might have to check and make sure that it was in fact stopped up, because if you tried to cheat, then you could get penalty tax. So that was another point of contention, is people trying to get around the tax would also come into conflict with the chimneymen for that reason. There was an exemption list. If you were, say, needy or disabled or something like that, you could go on a list which would be maintained by your local parish for Church of England. And this list would be basically people without enough resources, without the money to pay the tax, would be exempt. But otherwise, a wide swath of society would have to pay it, not just people who owned a home, but people who leased it. So tenants, if you were a tenant in a home, not the owner, you also owed the hearth tax. So this was certainly one method by which the tax was levied against people who were far less wealthy. They were not wealthy enough to own property. They were merely tenants. Even so, they had to pay the hearth tax. So that meant that a lot of people felt the sting of this tax. The interesting thing about the parish lists, the exemption lists, is this is a relatively significant data set of written records from this period of time about poor people and others who might not show up in a lot of other records. So it's a valuable record set for historians and researchers looking at this period of time. It's a relatively thin slice of time, maybe a generation or so, but it is still one of the few records where many of these people might have shown up on few other records that survive to this day. So interesting side effect, very unpopular tax that people didn't like, but also it did create one of the few written records for many of those people who were needy enough to be exempt. There was a lot of avoidance. So as I said, people tried to stop up chimneys. They would also take other methods to try and hide a hearth or a stove or fireplace. There were stories of people who used like a neighbor's chimney. They'd break through a wall or something like that, use some other method so that they could have a hearth, hide it when the chimneymen came through, but otherwise they would just use their neighbor's chimney so that it wouldn't give them away. It's obviously a huge fire hazard, so there are some stories that sometimes this would result in a fire because that's a dangerous practice. But just all in all, it was a very unpopular tax for a lot of these reasons, and so unpopular that after the Glorious Revolution, 1689, it was repealed. It was probably not one of the main causes of the Glorious Revolution, but it was certainly a cause of a lot of antagonism towards the crown, and that was why it really had to be repealed at that point. Very shortly after that, there was the window tax. So that lasted about 1696 to 1851, and it was a tax on windows, as you might suggest. So following shortly after the Hearth tax, they moved on to, among other things, the window tax. And there were different thresholds for this tax at 10 windows and 20 windows and so forth. The benefit was, unlike the chimneymen from the Hearth tax, you could count a window tax from outside a building. You still had to be close by, right? You had to walk up to the building, but you could stay outside, count the number of windows. So that was certainly a benefit over the Hearth tax, and avoided a lot of the arguments that had been used against the chimneymen for the Hearth tax. Some of the windows would be exempt if they were next to a room that was itself exempt. But in order to get this, you generally had to label the window on the outside and say the purpose, explain what the purpose was, just label it as, this is the purpose of this room. You would just say the name of it, and it would generally be like for some use other than someone sleeping or living in. A lot of large institutions might be able to make use of this. So they had like a storage room or something like that. That might be exempt. You can actually, to this day, in England, find buildings where windows have been blocked, where they have been bricked over, where clearly there used to be a window, but now it's full, or they're just something about the symmetry is off. That some of those situations are because of this window tax. Sometimes they're because of other reasons, but some of them do in fact date from the window tax. You can also still find in England some rooms where there's a label on the outside of the window that says their purpose, and often that is to get an exemption from this window tax. So it's interesting, you could still see a lot of the effects that the window tax had. So it lasted a lot longer than the Hearth tax, obviously, but was still also unpopular and was repealed in 1851. And then a tax that was partially contemporary with the window tax, but didn't last nearly as long, was the brick tax. So this started in 1784 and went to about the same time, 1850. It was generally considered necessary to cover the cost of the American Revolutionary War that the Crown had just lost. So it was a tax on bricks and tiles, and it was charged per piece, so per brick or per tile. If you had a more elaborate brick or more elaborate tiles, those would get higher taxes. The way it worked was it would be collected from the brick maker before a brick or tile was fired in a kiln. So the tax collector would have to actually go to these brick makers, look at each piece, make sure that the tax was paid, count them, and then they could be fired, and then they could be sold on. So obviously the benefit of that is you have a smaller group of people to check, and you know where they are. You generally know where those brick makers are. They need a large amount of stuff, large establishment, in order to have the kiln, in order to have all the materials, etc. They'd have workers, so you know where they are. You could go collect the tax from them. That's easier for the tax collector perspective, obviously. Unfortunately, the counterbalance is that means a smaller group of people is easier to check, but that means they experience more pain because the tax falls entirely on them. So it's a very specific tax focused on them. And there were brickmakers that were unable to survive because of this tax in part. That is a significant downside of a focused tax like this. The method of the tax was that the brick mold, would say excise on it. That would prove that a tax had been paid on that brick. So you can find bricks that say excise. And then after a certain period, towards the 1820s, the law was changed to exempt certain drainage pipes. So if a drainage pipe said drain on it or something like that, often that is probably there because that pipe had to get the exemption. So in order to clearly earn the exemption, it had to be labeled drain, so you could only use it as a drain. So if somebody saw that pipe some other in some other application and it said drain, they would know the tax wasn't paid. You can still find bricks and even drainage pipes in parts of England that will sometimes say excise or drain, and often that does date, in fact, to this period. So that's another situation where the influence of the tax can still be witnessed. The brick tax also resulted in avoidance when people tried to make bigger bricks. Because it was a per piece price, so per brick, if you just made a brick twice as big, then you could cover twice as much area and pay the same tax, or you could pay half as much tax to cover the same area, same thing. So they quickly figured that out, and the tax was amended to punish bigger bricks, to penalize them, so that set a standardized size for bricks after that. But from the period before the tax was changed, you can still in some places find walls made of these big bricks, and in certain cases that dates from this brief period before the tax was changed, when a bigger brick was a good tax avoidance. So you can still find that in certain parts of England where there's some big bricks that don't look right. That's because of this. Somebody wanted to shave a little off their tax bill. Another big avoidance that people did for this tax was making their homes out of lumber. Wood, obviously, that's not brick or tile, so you could avoid the brick tax if you just made a home out of wood, lumber. Another obvious effect was that since more elaborate bricks and tiles were more heavily taxed, and because the tax itself was expensive, brickwork in general from this period, the period during the tax, was much plainer, much simpler, much less developed, much less elaborate than before the brick tax, before 1784, or after the brick tax, after 1850. So it's often considered a hindrance to architecture for the period, to design, and it was it probably hurt industrial development. That's generally considered the reason it was repealed. That was the discussion at the time in the middle of the 19th century, was that it was not necessary and it was hurting England's industrial development. So three taxes, obviously very different, but you can certainly see the through lines, right? They are taxing specific things: your fireplace, your window, your bricks and tiles. Like, they were focusing on physical items that could be taxed. They would send a tax collector out into the world, either to everybody's house, or in the case of the brick tax, to a manufacturer. But they would send a collector out, they would count the taxable items, and then they would collect the tax. So that you can sort of see how these taxes are similar, and the consequences that they were unpopular for similar reasons, both because they discouraged things that people wanted, bricks, windows, fireplaces, but also because they were just considered especially intrusive, particularly with the hearth tax, but also with the brick tax and the window tax. You had to let people right up outside your house. You had to let people inside your business wandering around looking at your brick inventory if you're a brick maker. So very similar in all those respects, and you can see some of the downsides as well as some of the reasons perhaps that Parliament would have appreciated them, right? They were effective. They picked things that people wanted and they were likely to pay for. Even if they had to pay tax, they would still want windows. They would still need bricks, was the theory. Turned out they still used lumber, but bricks, windows, fireplaces were absolutely necessary to life. That was how you cooked. That was how you kept warm. So these were things that were good to tax in the sense that it was harder for people to get away from you. And that sort of sets up the tension, right? When it's hard for people to get away, you have a good thing where you can tax. You can see they've got some activity, some wealth, some value that you can sort of tax. You can take a little piece out of. But it also means that you can get people when they feel very vulnerable. So strong tension between those two impulses. They're closely connected, and it's always a balancing act. So these three taxes, not something that we see quite too much in modern tax, right? We see a lot more general taxes that try to be very broad. These are very specific physical things. They made a lot more sense in a time when fewer people could read. You wanted to focus on physical things. That was something that had a lot of appeal. And when there weren't large employers where you could get 1099s and W-2s and bank accounts where it was easy to track people, like, again, you needed to focus on things in their house, things that were around. So it made sense at the time for a society and an economy that was, whether it's the 17th century or the 19th century, that was different from the 20th and 21st century tax systems that I think most of us today are more familiar with. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pose them. There's a lot that you can research on these, but there's definitely a lot more to dig into, and if I made any mistakes, I apologize, but please feel free to pose any questions. Thanks.